This is the first recording for U.S. History, Phase 3, Chapter 10, Section 1, the African American Civil Rights Movement. I'm going to summarize the reading based on the questions that Mr. McGee had typed up and provided for you. All right, just follow along and I'll point out where the answers are. So the first question, it says, describe some of the ways rights were denied to African Americans since Reconstruction. Pardon me. And we'll start right now. A renewed struggle for civil rights. Since the period of Reconstruction after the Civil War, African Americans faced discrimination, especially in southern states. Jim Crow laws limited their freedoms. For generations, white Southerners continued to maintain economic, social, and political control over the South. Until well into the 20th century, much of the South was segregated or separated by race. Although such segregation was less apparent in the North, African Americans were generally restricted to poorer neighborhoods and lower paying jobs. All right, we'll move on to the second question, and it's in the next paragraph. After World War II, there was a renewed interest in achieving equal rights in all areas of life. Not until 1947 were African Americans permitted to play on Major League Baseball teams in this country. In that year, Jackie Robinson joined the Brooklyn Dodgers. This was one sign that public attitudes on segregation were beginning to change. President Truman appointed a presidential commission on civil rights in 1946. Based on his report, Truman called for the establishment of Fair Employment Practices Commission. Congress, however, failed to act on the idea. Using his powers as Commander-in-Chief, Truman issued Executive Order 9981, banning segregation in the armed forces. He also strengthened the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, which aided African Americans who challenged segregations in the courts. We just answered the first two questions. We're moving on to page 330 now, answering about who Earl Warren was. So, we'll go right here. The Warren Court. In 1953, a vacancy occurred on the Supreme Court. President Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren. He was a former governor of California as Chief Justice. Warren presided over the Supreme Court until 1969. During that period, the court reached a number of decisions that deeply affected many areas of American life. Among the most far-reaching of the West Warren Court's decisions were those dealing with civil rights for African Americans. So we just answered who Earl Warren was. Moving on to number 4. What was the decision in Brown v. Board? And what case did it overturn? So right here, it says Brown v. Board of Education. Only a year after he became Chief Justice, Warren presided over the court as it reached a landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, 1954. The Supreme Court actually combined several cases related to overturning state laws and allowed for school segregation in Kansas, Delaware, South Carolina, Virginia, and also in Washington, D.C. There were nearly 200 plaintiffs, including Oliver Brown, for whom the case was named. Linda Brown, his daughter, was a young African-American student who requested the right to attend a local all-white school in Topeka, her Topeka neighborhood, rather than attend an all-black school that was farther away. She was refused this opportunity by Topeka, Kansas Board of Education. Now we move on. In 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson decision held that the separate but equal public facilities were legal. Schools were such public facilities, and Brown was refused admittance to all-white school. The National Association for the Administration of Colored People, the NAACP, joined the case and appealed it all the way to the Supreme Court. In a unanimous decision, the court reversed the ruling of Plessy v. Ferguson and held that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. So there we go. Our answers there, right here. What was the decision for Brown v. Board? Basically, they had to grant them the same education so they could be integrated for blacks and whites together. What case did it overturn? It overturned the Plessy v. Ferguson case from 1896. All right. So number 5, it's asking, how did President Eisenhower enforce the Brown decision in Little Rock, Arkansas? That's on page 330 again. So we'll move over here. Right here we have President Eisenhower was reluctant to step in, but the governor's defiance was a direct challenge of the Constitution. Eisenhower placed the Arkansas National Guard under federal control and then used it to enforce integration. When President Eisenhower sent his federal troops, he acted in his presidential role as commander-in-chief. At the end of the school year, Governor Faubus continued his defiance by ordering all city schools closed for the following year. The tactic failed, however, and in 1959, the first racially integrated class graduated from Central High School. So prior to this paragraph where President Eisenhower pushed aside the National Guard, up here in this paragraph, the governor, Orville Faubus, sent in the National Guard to the schools in Little Rock to prevent the African-American students to attend the schools. President Eisenhower then basically shoved him aside and said, "No way, Jose," and sent in the federal troops, permitting it to happen, allowing it to happen. All right. So that would get you number 5. Number 6, number 6, it says, what protest did Rosa Parks inspire? Who became the leader of the civil rights movement? We're going to move on to 331, which is right here. So we're going to go in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1955. An African-American seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man and move to the back of the bus, as was required by law. She was arrested for violating the law, and her action inspired a boycott of the city's buses known as the Montgomery Bus Boycott. So that was the protest Rosa Parks inspired. And who became the leader of the civil rights movement? I'll give you a second to guess. Ding, ding. All right, it's right there. A young Baptist minister, Martin Luther King Jr. He emerged as the leader of the protest. King had studied the nonviolent methods of Mahatma Gandhi and Henry David Thoreau. His dynamic speaking style drew the attention and support of large numbers of people. The boycott lasted 381 days. In the end, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation of public buses was illegal. Although Rosa Parks did not plan that action on that day, her stand against injustice led the way for the others. All right. So number 7, we're moving on to page 332. Explain at least 2 ways African Americans began to organize. So we're on page 332, African Americans organized. So I'm going to read this, and this should give you your answers for this next question. African Americans formed a number of different groups that used a variety of approaches in the attempt to achieve justice and equality. In the early 1960s, many groups followed the nonviolent methods introduced by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, an organization of clergy who shifted the leadership of the civil rights movement to the South. Another organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, initially used nonviolent methods to promote the movement with its freedom rides and voter registration, fellas and girls, efforts. So now we're moving on to the next question. I'm going to read the rest of this. This is important, in my opinion. So we got, many civil rights activists used a form of protest called civil disobedience. This means the deliberate breaking of a law to show a belief that the law is unjust. For example, they attempted to use segregated facilities at interstate train stations and bus depots. Usually, they were arrested for such acts. Often, they were beaten. James Meredith. The push to integrate education continued. In 1962, James Meredith, an African-American Air Force veteran, made headlines when he tried to enroll into the all-white University of Mississippi. The governor of that state personally tried to stop Meredith from enrolling. Riots broke out and the federal marshals and the National Guard were called up. Although he had to overcome continued harassment, Meredith did finally enter and eventually graduate from the university. That's pretty cool. So the next question we have number 8. It says, describe the Birmingham protest. That's on page 333. So right at the top, we're going to start reading. It says, Birmingham, in 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC excuse me, began a campaign to bring integration to Birmingham, Alabama, which many consider to be the most segregated city in the South. At a protest march, police used dogs and fire hoses to break up the marches and arrested more than 12,000 people. One of those jailed was King, who then wrote his famous Letter from a Birmingham Jail, in which he defended his methods of nonviolent civil disobedience and restated the need for direct action to end segregation. Television cameras brought the scene of violence at the Birmingham protest to people across the country. This helped to build support for the growing civil rights movement. In Birmingham, the protests eventually resulted in the desegregation of city facilities. So that answers the question on number 8. Describe the Birmingham protests, right? So we'll move on to the next question. Number 8, what famous speech did King give in the March of Washington? That should be a fairly easy one, but we'll go on and read it right here. It says to the March of Washington, right here. We'll start reading. The growing civil rights movement moved President Kennedy to deliver a televised speech to the nation in June 1963 on the need to guarantee the civil rights of African Americans. This marked the first speech by a president specifically on this issue. 8 days later, he sent the most comprehensive civil rights bill to the nation's history to Congress. Civil rights groups organized in the March of Washington, a huge march on Washington, D.C. in August 1963 to show support for the bill. At the march, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous speech, I have a dream, speech to a crowd of more than 200,000 participants. In the speech, he eloquently expressed his hopes for a unified America. That answers number 9. So we'll move on to number 10. Why was Civil Rights Act of 1964 so important? That's going to be on page 334. Alrighty, so Civil Rights Act of 1964. We'll start right here. Johnson worked tirelessly for the passage of Civil Rights Bill, and in July of 1964, he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the most sweeping civil rights law in American history. The bill called for protection of voting rights for Americans, all Americans, opening of public facilities, restaurants, hotels, stores, restrooms, to people of all races, a commission to protect equal job opportunity for all Americans. Passage of the Civil Rights Act came just months after ratification of the 24th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished or got rid of the poll tax. Remember the poll tax? In order to vote, you had to pay a tax, and it really was a way to discourage African Americans from voting because it costs money to vote. All right, it just says that right there. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed race discrimination in public accommodations, including motels that refused rooms to African Americans. In the landmark Supreme Court case, Heart of Atlanta Motel v. United States 1964, racial segregation of private facilities engaged in interstate commerce was found unconstitutional. Title 8 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act, prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, or financing of dwellings based on the race, color, national origin, sex, or familial status. So it was important because it opened it up and gave African Americans a lot more rights that they haven't had up until that point. So number 11, it says, how was Malcolm X's ideology different from King's? That's page 335. We have Malcolm X. He's right here. Malcolm X, a more militant leader. Malcolm X began to attract a following from African Americans who were frustrated by the pace of the civil rights movement. Malcolm X spoke against integration, instead promoting black nationalism, a belief in the separate identity and racial unity of the African American community. A member of the separatist group Nation of Islam until 1964, Malcolm X broke with the group to form his own religious organization called Muslim Mosque, Inc. After a pilgrimage to the Muslim holy city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, during which he saw millions of Muslims of all races worshiping peacefully together, he changed his views about integration and began to work toward a more unified civil rights movement. He had made enemies, though, and in February 1965, he was assassinated at a New York City rally. All right, so how was Malcolm X's ideology different from King's? Initially, he wanted black nationalism. He wanted his own separate unification, all right? And he was a little more violent. So that completes the first section of the reading, African American Civil Rights Movement. Stay tuned. You'll have more to go. Thank you.